Hi, my question is for Professor Vamsi. Um, I'm wondering, I think we know some data on the wealth of the top 1% in India. Um, like, we keep getting these news about billionaires' wealth and all those things. So is it possible to make an guesstimate and then recalibrate the chart that you showed? Because uh, what is important is for us to know is also that the capital is locked within each layer. It's not like the capital available in the upper caste is accessible to the people in the lower band. So it helps me picture that better. So if you are ever reevaluating this one or recalibrating this one, please let us know.
So Prashant, so the issue with just adding some top 1% data to the existing surveys is that the methodologies of collecting data on the top 1% and on the entire distribution, these are very different. These methodologies are extremely different. So what we need to do is we need to figure out ways in which the top 1% is sampled better. So this is a concern not just for India. It's a concern for wealth surveys across the world. So for instance, US, when I said Gini coefficient for US is a little higher than India, it's 0.8. And for South Africa, for instance, the Gini coefficient is close to 1.96. And still, I made a couple of visits to South Africa. There's, the inequality is absolutely visible, right? Between blacks and whites in South Africa. The apartheid continues in economic terms, but they're still trying to get the top 1%. So this 0.96 is without the top 1%. So this is a hard thing to do. So in some countries, one way in which this has been overcome is by collecting tax data, and by analyzing tax data further, or estate taxes, for instance. You can try to compute the value of wealth, and then try to incorporate it along with the surveys in some consistent way. But this is a project that a lot of people are thinking about, because like you, I am also interested in getting the whole distribution. We have almost the complete distribution, but not the top 1 or 2%. Right? So yeah, I think it's a great question. Yeah.
If I can add a little bit to that. This is where I think it's important for us to see the system in the sense that this 1% is not available to rest of the caste, right? And if you look at the wealth in the upper caste, that is not available to rest of the caste. But it's also important that for us to recognize that if it is there with 1%, it is not available to others within that group as well. So that is where inequality is bad for everyone, not just for the upper caste or lower caste, right? So that needs to be seen. Like, if you look at the US case, for example, some of the billionaires, they just can't spend the money that they have. So they just don't know how to invest it, or they can't invest it in their lifetimes. And it is bad for the economy. It is bad for businesses. So that's the thing that I think we need to talk about and see the system as a bad system.
Thank you, both of you.
Hi, this is Anil. If I can ask a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Anil.
Yeah. So while the liberalization, we can say that has increased the inequality, it is also possible that the average income of everybody has risen, and therefore everybody is kind of benefited, although the inequality kind of increased. Is that so? Some average income data across these various groups would have helped, whereas the entire presentation was only on Gini. Thanks.
Okay, I think that's a question for me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
So, Anil, basically, if you look at our paper, we have presented all the average values of, of the various caste groups that are available. Given the fact that, this is a short presentation, I basically wanted to, show that, caste hierarchies still prevail. So if you actually look at, what has happened to, average wealth of different caste groups, it's, by the way, it's very hard to make an assessment because, for income, we have various deflators. You can't compare the nominal income of, let's say, 2012 to 2002 without deflating, the 2012 numbers to the 2002 levels. Basically, you have to take out the effects of inflation. Whereas in the case of wealth, it's much harder to get wealth deflators. We don't have wealth deflators in India. So that's part of the struggle. But nevertheless, we used income deflators or consumption deflators to look at what has happened to wealth holdings of different caste groups over time. And we presented those numbers, with all the limitations. And our tentative assessment is that, all the groups, at an average level have improved their wealth holdings, but at the same time, inequality levels have risen tremendously. So that is the, both in income terms and wealth terms, or consumption terms, there is an improvement of all groups, with economic growth. But, but it's, the rising tide does not lift all the boats to the same extent. There's a continuation of the existing caste hierarchy. Some boats are lifted a lot higher than, than other boats. And that is the point I was able to make. Although, you are absolutely right. I think, one could argue that, the average levels of wealth have somewhat improved even at the lower levels. In a period of very high growth, that's bound to happen. But it's disappointing, because it's not been, on the whole, an inclusive growth kind of phenomenon that India has witnessed. And caste hierarchies have deepened, and inequalities along the hierarchy have, have intensified, have grown, right, in the last 25, 30 years. Maybe Hari has something to add.
Yeah, in fact, Vamsi, this is the debate that we also have in the management area. Some people argue that we just need to look at poverty, not inequality, because incomes of people are going up and the poverty levels have decreased. But what we see from a number of studies is that it doesn't matter what your income level is, but when inequality is very high, it has a negative effect on the organizations and on societies. So both poverty and inequality both need to be studied, and they both need to be considered in any analysis. I think that's it's important to recognize that.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Hari and Vamsi and Hari. Sujata, yeah, you can go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question to Professor Bapuji, because the across corporations that you're talking about, is there, do you have any breakup in terms of the sectors or the classes where there's more condensation or stratification, like Professor Vakulabharanam spoke about, whereas there are other sectors where it has, leveled the playing field, and what were the driving factors to that? Thank you.
That's a good question. There's been very little work in the management to examine things like that. So very few papers or very few researchers have looked at it. And only now we are saying it. But the sector-wise, we haven't seen a lot of, there isn't anything that I can say would point towards some sectors being more open. But definitely what we see, at least one study, what it has shown is that in jobs that require hard skills are the ones where the knowledge is more standard or more codified, or where you can test, then the discrimination tends to be lower. Whereas the jobs in which the knowledge is very difficult to codify, where the social skills or cultural skills are required, so then the discrimination tends to be higher. So if we extend that, you would see that the sectors in which, like IT sector, for example, right? So there's been a bit of a level playing field, whereas in other sectors you wouldn't see that. Let's say financial analysts, for example, right? You're unlikely to see that. So, but yeah, I'm hoping that in the coming years, a number of our colleagues will start to look at this a bit more systematically. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pradeep Patri, right?
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, thank you. This was really interesting discussion, actually. I have a question for both the professors, actually. Let me first go with Professor Vamsi. You presented the data that showed that in the urban case, like for the scheduled caste, their share in wealth is lower than the share of scheduled tribe. I wanted to know what are some of the reasons behind that. You said that there's been like data is not very much representative, but still, could you maybe mention some of the reasons, because it's bit surprising for me, at least, like that wealth share for scheduled caste is lower in urban areas than scheduled tribes. And I will come back to Professor Hari after this question, maybe. Yeah.
So, Pardeep, I have tentative answers to your question. The first is, as I mentioned already, and as you noted, I think it's a very small sample. So, I'm not entirely certain that, scheduled caste data in cities is being collected very carefully. But so that's the first point, so I'm raising questions about the data quality in this case. But given the data, what I noticed is that, there's much greater polarization within the sample that was collected, for scheduled tribes. So there is a preponderance of, somewhat, better off scheduled tribes, probably, people who have benefited from affirmative action and, who are in bureaucratic jobs, these are the people that they interview. And, then, they have interviewed some poor people belonging to the scheduled tribe category. So, so what happens is, because it's more polarized, you get the sense that, on the average, scheduled tribes are doing better. But I think, it's the polarization that is driving that result. And in terms of, a comparison, I think, scheduled castes have a much longer history of living in urban spaces compared to scheduled tribes. And they've also been, performing, as, as Hari already talked about, they've also been performing, in occupations that are not considered as valuable as, the other communities. I think, scheduled tribe communities are more recent entrants into urban spaces. So that could also explain, it's, I think the poverty in terms of wealth here of scheduled castes is much longer. There's a deeper historical basis in urban spaces and compared to the scheduled tribes. That's one point. The second point is, as cities grow in India, I'm sure, many of you, who have seen, Indian city growth have observed this phenomenon. They tend to incorporate villages, so, a city grows and it takes over a village, that is, that is right next to it. And as more and more villages get incorporated, scheduled caste communities which are in the villages also get incorporated. And what happens is, they're not trained to be in the urban space, right? But now they're being counted as urban residents, but they're not really performing in the urban economy. So they're still in the rural economy, still trained to perform in the rural economy, and suddenly they're pushed into the urban space. So you actually see, scheduled caste communities entering the city space with a huge, it's just, an administrative incorporation without retraining or without providing them the, the facilities or, the access that Hari talked about, education or health or, other matters. So some of those, issues may be at play in the difference that is visible in the data.
Thank you so much for it. You mentioned that, let me just maybe come back with another question, like is same like clarification a bit. I would like that you mentioned that scheduled caste had gathered more poverty while living there, like they've been living there for years and years before scheduled tribe arrived there. That was also my concern actually. Like that's what I was thinking when I first asked you this question, because then at the same time, don't you think that scheduled caste also might have gathered the assets as well in terms of wealth and some money saving or something like that?
So that's the interesting question, right? When the way discrimination or exclusion works, whether in rural or urban spaces, it doesn't matter how long you are in a certain space, you are shut out from the access to resources. You are shut out from, accumulation of wealth. You are shut out from, all those capitals that Hari also discussed. You are shut out from access. And this can perpetuate itself. It's like, a poverty trap. Think of a poverty trap. Once you are in the poverty trap, it's a vicious cycle that pulls you lower, right? So unless there is a conscious action to address this issue and address this inequality and introduce policies, introduce, various measures to correct that inequality, my result basically is, markets didn't do the job, right? And prior to 91, the Indian state, with a more proactive state between 1950 and 1947 and 1991, even that slightly more proactive state failed to deliver for both rural Dalits and urban Dalits. So yeah, so they've stayed for a much longer period, but they've also been excluded for a very long period. And it's like a trap. Once you are in a trap, it's hard to get out of that trap. That is my intuition, from my own lived experience. This doesn't come out entirely only through data. So even as economists, we go and do field research. We really need to understand the economic processes at work on the ground. So whenever I go to do field research, this is the experience I had. There's always a small proportion of the community that may escape the trap, but that's really, really small. And what the data is picking up in these surveys is all those, the entire proportion of the Dalit community in cities, that have been perpetuated into the wealth poverty trap.
Thanks, Pardeep. So you have any question for Hari? You said you have.
Yeah, I have one question, but do you have time? Like, I don't know. I don't want to take other people's time.
Yeah. Okay, we'll come back to it. So yeah, I have one more person. So Karthik, can you go ahead? You said you have a question, right?
Hi, Professor Vamsi and Professor Hari. Thank you very much for your really very insightful and this is very much needed on the ground. Mike, I have two questions. One is, we have a very clear link between the caste and economical inequality. If it is the fact, on what basis the government has gone for the reservation for the so-called upper caste, because excluded SC, ST and OBCs, and they have provided 10% to the so-called upper caste, where their population itself is close to the 10%. And the BJP proposed, Congress supported, the left party is voted, and the BSP also voted. the party which represents the interest of Dalits. That's the first question. Second is, your Vamsi's presentation very clearly shown that how the liberalization policies have not empowered the Dalits, rather it improvised them more. If it is the fact, don't the Dalits need to question the privatization, and they have to make the demands for the renationalization of the core industries? Because the capital in the core industry is the one which makes a huge impact on the other service industries, and they are very inextricably coupled. So you cannot have your core industry as private and other industry as public or other way. So what Dalit have to do on the second question? These are my two questions to both of the speakers. Thank you.
Hari, do you want to go first?
These are difficult questions. Maybe you should go first.
Okay, fine. No, I think those are excellent questions. I mean, we really have to carefully think through. So, my answer to your first question is, the entire philosophy, of why affirmative action was created, the way it was created in India, is totally, misunderstood in the formulation of, the reservations for upper caste kind of a logic. The logic, of creating reservations, people like, thinkers like Gail Omvedt, for instance, of course, Ambedkar, but, even, American sociologist Gail Omvedt has written a lot on these issues. What they've argued is, it's not the economic logic alone that becomes the basis for affirmative action in India, right? So state is state employment is a very small proportion of the total employment. State employment is, somewhere between 5 and 8% of the total employment in India, right? It's a very small proportion. So what is at stake really in providing access to state employment for, various communities? You are trying to create a representative state, right? That, which spans all the different communities. So in order to provide access to the marginalized communities or the disadvantaged communities in political power and, some amount of economic power, you provide access to state resources, right? State employment, right? State employment or, representation in state legislatures or state bodies. That was the logic of creating, the Indian reservation system. But it's just, when there is a populist measure of that kind, there is always, the populist measure is the policy that was introduced recently, which is, reservations for the upper caste. For the longest time, when I was growing up in a small town in Andhra, people have said, but there are poor people among upper castes also. Why can't they get reservation, right? That's a backlash from the upper caste. Why are we not entitled to the same benefits as the poor people? It's basically, the privileged wanting more privilege, right? So there, the question is, it's true that there are some poor people, among upper castes as well, but that is not the policy of Indian affirmative action, right? So you could create other policies, to alleviate poverty. You could create other policies to alleviate economic inequality. Reservations are not meant to do that, not meant to address directly the question of poverty or economic inequality. They are meant to address the question of, whether the state is representative of all the different communities that exist in India, right? So it's a fundamental categorical confusion. And because, there is a certain proportion of the vote that is at stake, all these parties sold out, right? I mean, the greatest disappointment, I have to openly admit, is left parties. There was not a murmur of protest. In fact, they supported it from the very beginning. And I personally think, that was really, really, either they, totally misunderstood the cornerstone of Indian affirmative action, or, they were just going with the populist sentiment. either way, it's a problem. You should, I mean, if you are a responsible left party, you should know how this system was created. And to the extent that, they went along with this position, I was deeply critical of, I'm in favor of, the state acting as a welfare state and, going and supporting poor people from any community, right? Muslims or, all poor need some kind of state support in capitalism. There is no safety net that capitalism automatically provides, right? So that safety net can be provided by the state, but the affirmative action policy, distorting that policy, is not the way of doing it, right? So I hope, you got the at least some picture of what I wanted to say on this. On the second question, this is a more difficult question. Liberalization and Dalits. So there are some Dalit activists, who have always taken a position that market reforms are good for Dalit communities in India. I remember, Gail Ombet is like a hero for me. I read some of her articles and I got radicalized along caste lines. I had a huge debate with her in Madison, Wisconsin at the South Asia Conference in the late 90s. I basically met her and I told her, you are my hero. You are the one who radicalized me on caste related issues. And then she said, liberalization is great for Dalit communities. And I was actually doing my field research in Andhra at that time, Telangana, on farmer suicides. And a lot of farmers who died during that tragic phenomenon are Dalit farmers. So I pointed out to Gail Ombet, how could you, ignore, the harmful effects of market reforms on. The debate at that time was, what did the more proactive state until 1991 do? Because, it was captured again by upper caste. They promoted their own, economic position. Markets at least will liberate. Markets will be the great leveler. And I think, now there is no doubt whatsoever that, markets did not deliver in terms of equalization. I think, markets have heightened inequality along, class lines, but also deeply along caste lines, right? So what should Dalits do? I think, see, this whole market model, neoliberal model, is in a great crisis. Just think about, what this country is doing. America First is not a neoliberal policy. Anti-globalization is not a neoliberal policy. So there's much greater distrust or mistrust about markets after 2008. So there is a need for the state to step in now and address the deep market failure in most societies across the world now. And I think that has to be done, very systematically and carefully. But the political economy of this is, the bailout packages after 2008 protected the financial capital, which created the global crisis in the first place. So they are preventing change from happening. And now, the fight is out on the streets, in the political domain. So I'm waiting for that kind of a fight to emerge in India. I don't think, the poor are benefiting from a market-oriented model. But when will the fight happen? When will the resistance emerge? And I'm fairly clear that, the Dalit communities are not making, any relative gains vis-a-vis other castes, through the market reform process. So yeah, resistance has to happen. And, there has to be a creation of a decent public sector in core goods, as you are saying. And that can also be a great provider of employment. We have to go back to thinking about, how corporations themselves, and Hari is an expert on this, corporations themselves can, not just mouth social responsibility, corporate social responsibility, as a duty or something, but actually, deliver on their social responsibility goals. I'm talking about the private sector, but, public sector at least will be tasked with that, from the very beginning. It's not just profitability, it's also providing employment, it's also providing welfare. And that was the model. And, since the neoliberal model has been discredited, the objective conditions are there. But when will the change happen? That when resistance happens. And I think, all evidence is clear now that, that resistance ought to come about. But we are going through a very weird time in India right now. So, so we'll have to see how various forces align.
Thank you.
Let me very briefly answer that. One is that in terms of what the Indian government did, I think this was a long pending demand. So they're experimenting with it. The way I would like to say it is that, in the history of civilization, in the progress of societies, various initiatives happen, and this is one initiative. We'll have to wait and see how this is going to play out. Okay, so that's one, and of course, for the reasons as to why that happened, and all those, it's a political move that all of us know. With respect to the second, yes, I think the decline of the public sector, and more importantly, the decline of the formal sector, right? How even corporations are reducing jobs that are in-house and are outsourcing. So those are some of the things that are going against the marginalized people all over the world. It's just not the Dalits in India or blacks in the US, but it is all over the world. The marginalized people are kind of able to get only those jobs which are not secure, which are not high paying, right? So that's a problem that's going on all over the world, and that needs to be discussed and talked about, and we need to ask for changes to some of those things. And again, the management researchers are just beginning to grasp and grapple with this particular issue. So hopefully, there will be some discussion. Otherwise, 5, 6, 10 years ago, it would be unthinkable for somebody to talk about inequality in a management field. But now there are a number of us who are talking about it. So I think there will be more people coming in and talking about it. Thank you.
So yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Selva, can you go ahead?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, thank you, Professor Vamsi and Hari, for your great speech. It's packed with a lot of facts. My question is about 1991 economic reform. So I'd like to know if the economic reform happened all across the sector or industries, and especially the agriculture industry, where Dalits are 90% Dalits are laborers. So if that has the way and where the economic reform happened has anything to do with the disparity in the rate of wealth increase. Thank you.
Okay, so agriculture was the last sector that witnessed reforms, and so reform started with the external sector, with domestic restructuring, privatization of existing public sector industries, promoting a lot of private sector industries. The Manmohan Singh government, which initiated market reforms, they were a little afraid of initiating reforms in agriculture at the very beginning. So they waited until 1995-96 to actually introduce reforms in agriculture. And when reforms were introduced, there were two kinds of reforms. One is connecting Indian agriculture with the global agriculture, so that Indian farmers benefit from global prices. That was the logic. And the second one is attacks on what they called as market imperfections, provision of subsidies, or provision of any government support to the poor farmers. And that was seen as creating market imperfections which would lead to inefficiencies. And what actually happened as a result of these two sets of reforms is one, starting in 95, 96, there was a deep agricultural recession across the world. And when we integrated into the world agricultural economy, we imported the world recession in agriculture into our economy. And a lot of farmers, large number of farmers who had just learned to, cultivate slightly, cash-inducing crops, cash crops. They witnessed, declines in agricultural prices after 96, 97. And then you see, the suicide phenomenon emerging unevenly across the country. But, hitting the really poor farmers, especially Dalit farmers who got, who had some access to land or they were tenants and so forth. And one of the one of the ways in which Dalit farmers were able to make some gains in the 70s and 1980s is through state support. This is something that Indira Gandhi started, as part of the populist measures that she initiated in the 70s. But, they helped the poor farmers for a couple of decades, to make both ends meet or, to improve their well-being to some extent. Once the market reforms were introduced in agriculture post 95, 96, and there was a withdrawal of subsidies or, there was withdrawal of, reduction in minimum support kinds of structures, starting in the mid 90s, it adversely affected, poor Dalits and of course, poor OBCs, the farming community. And once the farming community was affected, it also has a deep impact on agricultural laborers, right? A lot of agricultural laborers are Dalits. I mean, agriculture, about 50 to 60% of agricultural laborers in most of the Indian context are Dalit laborers. So when farming itself becomes somewhat unprofitable, then, laborers also, face the, the crisis or the distress, agrarian distress that emerge. So, so this is the greatest, problem with Indian economic liberalization. Urban spaces at least, witnessed some growth. They also witnessed increase in inequalities, but Indian agriculture collapsed. It went through a very deep crisis between 1997 and it continued almost until 2007. And unevenly after 2007, there was agricultural growth in some parts of the country. But by then, the poor farmers who, had made some gains, or agricultural workers who were witnessing some wage increases and poverty declines as a result in the 70s and 80s, starting in roughly 1977 until 1990, there was a decline in poverty among agricultural workers. Those trends, have been reversed, because of, reforms that were introduced in agriculture. So that is the greatest tragedy. And that's one thing that I mentioned in my first slide. There's also urbanization happening in the background of, all these rising wealth inequalities. And we should keep that in mind, because, the poor who stay back in villages, they are abandoned, especially after market reforms were introduced. And the policy reversal to some extent happened after 2004 with the, National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme that was introduced. And I think that was helpful because, it provided alternative employment, it provided, but that is not a reform measure. That's a measure that is supposed to counteract the ill effects of market reforms, right? And it was a policy space that was won through struggle of people. People struggled to, before 2004, there were major social movements that emerged in various rural areas. And in response to that, the government was forced to concede a policy like that, right? And that's also been diluted in more recent times. So, yeah, I mean, the answer to your question is, I think, agricultural reforms which were introduced a little late, mid-90s, not 1991, have been extremely harmful.
Thank you, Professor Vamsi. So I think we can have one more question, last question, if anyone has. Pardeep, you want to go?
Yeah, I can ask. My
Yeah,
question is
let's do.
for Professor Hari. Professor Hari showed one slide in which it was, I think it was titled "Privilege and Hiring Process" or something like that. And there were some green cells, and some were left kind of. Those were filled, and some were gray. I just want to know that because I could fill all those cells, but like one example was something like references, but here social capital is also at play here. So I just want to know that what was the criteria behind that? Why were like only certain cells were like shown green, or is it like these are the more at play, or their effect is more, or there was something else going on? And I have something maybe a bit, I would say quickly also about that.
Yeah,
You
please, please.
mentioned,
Yeah.
yeah, you mentioned about professor mentioned about the this behavior aspects of employees in the organization that needs to be changed. But like in Indian context, like our behavior is much more influenced by our religious beliefs and personal beliefs, which are kind of embedded in our scriptures and all that. So how easy it is for like organizations to kind of bring change in their personal beliefs, and what role they can play?
Thank you, Pradeep. So firstly, like it is possible to look at, or it's possible to see how each of those are affected. But I try to go from step by step in terms of from advertisement to the time that one goes into the interview. So the other factors are less likely to play a role in it. Okay, and this is thinking in progress, and I'm sure we will work on this further to see how best we can explain some of these things so that the hiring practices can take into account these things. I mean, looking at organizational practices or HR practices is something I've only started to recently do. So hopefully we can improve upon this, and I'm sure you and I can talk more about this as well outside. And second, in terms of how it is how caste and religion and all of these things condition us. Yes, it is very difficult. But I think it's something that corporations have not paid attention to so far, and only now there is discussion about it. So hopefully something will change, and just like there's been progress in terms of gender and racial diversity and inclusion programs, there's a lot that we can learn from that and draw on and build programs for addressing other marginalized communities inclusion, including caste related diversity. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and we've just only begun. Okay. Anything else, or?
No, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I can also actually quickly go back to your earlier comment, question about the difference between the Dalits and Adivasis wealth being very surprising.
Yeah,
so there are
sure,
a couple of things here that come to my mind. There was a study in which Ashwini Deshpande is a co-author. What they find is that when you look at the discrimination that is faced, the Adivasis do not face the same kind of discrimination, and we are finding something similar in the study with that Pratik and Pankaj at IIM Bangalore are conducting. Is that when you account for education and other things, the earnings gap goes away for all other communities, but for Dalits it still remains. So what we are thinking is that it is because of the kind of stigmatization that they face. The stigmatization that is faced by the Adivasis is different from the the level of or the type of stigmatization that is faced by Dalits. I think that can explain to some extent what the difference. But again, we need to look a little bit more into it.
Yeah, thank you so much for it. Yeah, I think there is another factor that maybe Sanskritization of Adivasi is much more, and they could go much closer to the upper caste. So that could be also. That's I'm out of my head, just thinking. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hari. Thanks. Yeah. So with that, we'll wind up the session today. So I would like to thank again for both of you, Professor Vamsi and Dr. Hari Bapuji. It was an excellent presentation and very lively discussion. So for all those participants, do watch for our further series. We are planning to do some more series on this, and do share that with your friends and encourage them to participate in the discussion. So thank you all. Have a good evening and have a good day, great day. Thank you.
And thank you to the organizers. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you everyone.